So we're continuing with semantics, but also moving into syntax, because actually a lot of these areas of linguistics really overlap a lot. Semantics overlaps with morphology, and especially with syntax and morphology overlap, and phonology and morphology overlap, and all. And so we'll wrap up semantics today, some of the problems of traditional approaches and some kind of newer approaches in semantics, and how all this stuff kind of mixes with the syntax and affects syntax as we get into syntax today. Traditional semanticists and Chomskyan linguists, generative linguists, tend to assume that meaning and grammatical structure are completely different things. And while the grammar, and especially the syntax, may not directly express meaning, and as we'll see, another theory of linguistics says that it kind of does. So, meaning is one thing, and for purposes of studying it, it helps to separate it into its own thing. And they view syntax as something kind of different. It's more like a packaging system. You have your meaning, and then you package it up into nice syntactic units so that the listener can then unpack it and understand your message, what you're saying. And that's true. Syntax, the grammar, is kind of a packaging mechanism for packing up your meaning into discrete, specific units that make meaning clear so that listeners or readers can unpack them and understand them. But there's a little more to it than that, as we will see. Phrasal verb particles is kind of unique to Germanic languages. There's something kind of similar in German. I don't know of many other languages that do that. Korean has some compound verbs. So phrasal verbs in English, they're sort of compound verbs. It's a special kind of compound verb. And Korean has compound verbs, but they're very different. They're not formed where you don't have prepositions, you have postpositions, but those don't make compound verbs in Korean. What you do in Korean is you combine two different verbs, and one of them might take on more of a functional aspect or a metaphorical aspect. So with tura kada, tura oda, the kada oda part has more of a directional meaning of the direction relative to the speaker's perspective. And in other compound verbs in Korean, one of the elements takes on a more metaphorical aspect. So you might take two regular verbs and compound them. It's a famous example in the literature on Korean semantics is 버리다, which by itself means to throw away. But you compound it, 잊어버리다, which becomes more of a degree or extent, like you completely forgot, 잊어버렸어요. Or the kind of, maybe not appropriate for talking about relatives, but 죽어버리다, which is like to completely die. It emphasizes the dying. And it's not something you would say of someone in a respectful environment, maybe someone you don't like, and it's hard to translate 죽어버리다 into English. Maybe he croaked, he bit the dust, you'd have to use an idiom to translate it. But it emphasizes the degree. Wrap up semantics, get into like newer ideas about semantics in the past 40 years, and then start talking about syntax. Syntax is kind of hard. It's rather theoretical and abstract. So in my lectures, I'll try to unpack it, mainly just what you need to know. So in my lectures, I kind of walk you through just the basic ideas of syntax and what you need to know for syntax in a few minutes, today and Thursday. Limits of traditional semantics. We talked about some of the problems of traditional or formal semantics. Compositionality, it explains a lot, like the whole is the sum of the parts in terms of meaning, like the meaning of a phrase or sentence. And that works, but not always. We see some examples where it doesn't work. Traditional approaches kind of focus on features and sets, like, well, if you say dog, it's a member of this set of things called dog. Dogs, and it's defined by certain features, forelegs, barks, hairy, whatever. And you do the same for other words like table and game and bird we did. But as we saw, these break down. These don't always work. These don't explain everything. These don't explain real usage and context. These maybe explain kind of the face value or literal meaning of a word, but it doesn't really give you a satisfying description that is psychologically accurate. I talked about qualia, things like red or hungry or happy. you can't define these terms very easily without just using a synonym or defining it in terms of other terms. Red as well, it's kind of between orange and yellow on the spectrum, things like that. They're hard to define, they're subjective. It's hard to define. Relational meanings, some words are defined relationally. Reference became kind of a problem in traditional semantics. The assumption is if you have different words, they should refer to different things. But you run into this problem with the morning star, evening star, and Venus. They all refer to the same star, just at different times of the day or different contexts. So there is what we call the face value or truth conditional meaning of a word. A bachelor is defined as such and such. You can talk about truth conditions, you can talk about face value meaning, but that only gets you so far. There's a different approach that came about starting in the 70s. It's called cognitive semantics, which is based on theories in cognitive psychology. So what psychologists found is everything that we know about the psychologists talked about semantics too in a slightly different way. Everything we know about the world in reality is encoded into our minds in what we call schemas. A schema is kind of a structured framework for representing information in our minds. Now, there are different kinds of schemas, and you can take a psychology course, an advanced psychology course, and learn more about schemas and the different kinds of schemas and how they work. But so for example, a child learns the word doggy and a dog. The child builds kind of a mental framework, a conceptual framework for what a dog is based on her experiences, their family dog and other dogs that she sees, and starts to develop and from the different examples and experiences of dogs, the child is going to kind of abstract away from that and develop kind of a schema, kind of an abstractified representation of dog and dogness that's defined maybe at first by the examples that she's seen. Now, when the child is learning the language and she sees another four-legged animal like a cat, she might point to it and say doggy, because she doesn't know. Until parents say, oh, it's a cat or a kitty, and she develops a new schema. And so they're kind of connected, dog and cat, or doggy and kitty. They have a lot of elements in common, and they belong to maybe a bigger schema now of four-legged animals or family pets or animals or mammals or something like that, and on and on and on. It's a conceptual framework, and we can test this. For example, if we think about a bird schema. In psychology tests, you show subjects pictures on the screen or words on the screen and say, is this a bird? Punch yes or no. If it's a typical bird like, a sparrow, a robin, a gatsi, a magpie or something, they'll respond very quickly. But less typical members of that category, they are slower to respond. Penguins, ostriches, kiwis, they're slower to respond. And so this is psychological evidence for kind of an abstractified schema, and it consists of it's based on maybe the most typical members of that set, but then less typical members are part of that schema, but they're kind of on the periphery of that conceptual framework, and that's a schema. And there's a lot of evidence in psychology since the 1930s for this kind of thing. Every word you know probably exists as a schema in your brain. Maybe a very small set of neurons for function word schemas, but a table schema is based on your experiences with tables, what they are for, what they do, typical kinds of tables and such. It's a conceptual framework. So you have a conceptual framework, and it's defined by some kind of an abstractified representation in your brain. Exactly what that looks like in your neurons, we're not sure, but it's an abstractified representation, and it's connected to other related schema. Table schema is connected to, chairs and sofas and couches and other furnitures and classrooms and such. So it's a conceptual representation in your mind. It's kind of like a framework, and it's connected to other related concepts. So the most common type of schema is probably your prototype schema, one that's kind of, say if schemas for kind of more concrete words like table, and maybe more abstract schemas for things like love and what that represents, and based on experiences and examples and definitions, you create a kind of an abstract schema. What's your most typical flower? Well, you might think of, roses and tulips and daffodils and daisies and such. Furniture is a little more abstract. Can Can you picture furniture in your mind? Well, not in itself, unless you picture maybe specific kinds, like tables and chairs. So it's kind of like a super schema, a superset schema that consists of more concrete schemas like tables and chairs and bookshelves. And same for equipment. What is equipment? Well, computers and machines and stuff like that, laboratory equipment or such. Less typical members will take you longer to identify. They're a bit further from that prototype or that core representation of a noun. Again, there are different kinds of schemas in psychology, but cognitive semantics focuses on kind of like prototype schema. A noun, for example, or a verb is defined primarily by the most typical members of that set from which you develop some kind of an abstract representation in your mind, and it's connected to other related things. And those are schemas. So, for example, if you're taking a course and you don't understand the material and you have to memorize a lot of words, maybe a biology course, it's hard because if you don't understand the concepts, you can't connect it with knowledge you already know. You can't connect it with your existing schemas, your existing schematic knowledge. And you're maybe memorizing a bunch of words, or maybe when you learn English, you had to memorize a lot of vocabulary for the test. Do you remember that? No. After a few weeks, it's gone. After you take the test, it's all gone because your brain couldn't schematize it. It couldn't incorporate this new information into existing schemas, into existing knowledge frameworks. A lot of research in education, psychology, that proves that, by the way. Learning a language by just memorization is not effective. Yeah, to some degree at the beginning stages, when you first learn a new language, you have to memorize a lot. But for example, high school and college students in Korea learning English, it's not very effective. They know enough English, they don't need to memorize a lot of words that they'll probably never use for a test. It doesn't do them any good. The brain cannot incorporate that memorized information into the new schemas, into their existing schemas, or it can't easily create new schemas based on old. You maybe form a new schema, a child learns about kitty, based on an existing schema like dog. But what this buys us in terms of semantics is the ability to take meanings and extend it. So think of your schema for fire. It's hot, it's intense, it's strong, it may be unpleasant if you get close to it. Humans, as far as I know in probably most languages, will use that as a basis for a metaphor. We'll take that schema for fire and extend it to new things like anger. Why? Because you're making a metaphor. Anger is an intense and strong and maybe harmful, like fire. She's burning with anger. So we have a lot of metaphors in our languages where anger is fire or hot. And this is an important insight of cognitive semantics. The face value or literal meaning of words alone is not enough, because in real context, we often use a lot of words metaphorically, and you may not realize it. And this kind of blends the boundaries between semantics and pragmatics. But then again, the point is, literal or face value meaning of words alone is not enough in real context, in real life. I'm going up to Austria if you live in so you might be in Germany, but you go up to Austria. Why? Because it's higher elevation, mountains, But it's also sort of metaphorical. You're not going up like that, but you're going that way, going up to Austria. The argument has no content. We talk about arguments and content. Why? It's like argument should have substance. This is sort of metaphorical content, like a container having content. She had a great influence on me. Why on? Because we view on influence as something like a force acting. It's like a force acting on a surface. If I hit a surface, it's a force acting on a surface. And we, in English, view metaphorically influence as like a force acting on a surface. This gets more into pragmatics, but the ham sandwich wants another soda. What does that mean? This is something that waitresses might say in a restaurant. What does that mean? When waitresses might say this in a restaurant, the customer who ordered the ham sandwich wants a soda. And this is kind of more pragmatics too. So waitresses will say the ham sandwich, meaning the customer who had the ham sandwich. It's kind of an association metaphor. So notice if you're a literature person, we're using metaphor in a slightly different way than in literature, meaning we're just extending the meaning in a new way. In literature studies, you may have a very strictly defined meaning of metaphor, but here in linguistic metaphor, we're extending the meaning. Afghanistan has become another Vietnam. What does this mean? Well, just like America's involvement in the Vietnam War was very badly conceived and done, likewise, what the U.S. has done in Afghanistan is parallel to its mistakes in the Vietnam War. Vietnam has become a metaphor in American culture for a very stupid or badly conceived or badly done war or military action. This car is a lemon. What does that mean? Does it mean it goes well with black tea? No. This is an English idiom, meaning it doesn't work. It's badly made. Like Ford cars in the 1980s, I think they're much better now, but in the 1980s, Ford was famous for making lemons, also in the 1950s. And we would joke, Ford stands for fix or repair daily, or found on the road dead. Lemons. This is for like devices or equipment that don't work. You buy a cell phone, oh, it's a lemon. You buy a computer, it's a lemon. It doesn't work. Why? Why lemon? Why do we say lemon? Well, how does a lemon taste? Sour. So you have a sour experience. In English, especially in American English, this has become a metaphor for a device that doesn't work. The politician was hounded by reporters. So thinking back to the dog schema, so hound is a kind of dog for hunting. So later on you learn about different kinds of dogs, and they're hound dogs, which is kind of this dog for hunting originally. So what does it mean that the reporter was hounded by reporters? He was being chased, followed by reporters like a hound dog hunting a squirrel, or hound dog hunting a rabbit or something. A metaphor. Now, we often think of argument as war. He attacked my views. Language as transmission or conduit for meaning, get a point across, put ideas into word. Language is full of metaphor. When I say language is full of metaphor, I'm actually using a metaphor, full. Because is language, is it a container? Well, not literally. It's an abstract concept. When I say language is full of metaphor, I am making a metaphorical statement. We do this all the time. You're not aware of it. Phrasal verbs, prepositions are often used metaphorically in English and other languages that use these things. Metaphorical use is common throughout our language, and we just don't realize it. We don't think about it. If you start to think about, analyze things you say and write, you realize that there are a lot of metaphorical uses involved. And so I asked you, love is, and a lot of you responded with metaphors. Love is magic. Maybe not literally, but it's like a metaphor. Love is blind, that's a metaphor. That song in my head from the 1980s, Love is a Battlefield, it's a metaphor. So we often use metaphors, not just in poetry, but in daily life, in our daily language. Even language you think of as academic prose has metaphor. What this gives us is a better way of thinking of categories like dog represents a category, but it's not so strictly defined. You can have like fuzzy boundaries. You know, what's a dog? When I came to Korea and found all these small dogs that are popular here, like, to me that's not a dog, it's more like a big rat, you know, because I'm used to what Koreans would call big dogs in the States, which to me is more like a medium-sized dog, and as well as big dogs, like a Great Dane. If you don't know Great Dane, we had 2 Great Danes in my family when I was a teenager. They're about this tall, beautiful animals, very kind, but I'm used to that kind of, to me that's a dog. And these little things that I see people walking here in the parks in Korea looks like a rat. So to me, that's kind of a less typical member of the dog category, but I guess for Koreans, it's more of a typical dog, and you might look at a Great Dane and think, oh, that's a horse. We talked about grammaticalization, and it's kind of similar. In fact, you could argue that grammaticalization, when you take like as a content word which expresses similarity and use it as a function word in colloquial and slang English, I'm like, yeah, that's like really cool, man. You're kind of using it, you're extending the meaning kind of metaphorically, similarity. Or sometimes use it to kind of couch metaphors. I slept like all day long. And maybe I don't mean literally all day long, but kind of like that. So I might use it to qualify or indicate metaphor and hyperbole. Now let's talk about grammar and metaphor. Verb categories. Maybe not, so the idea of not so much metaphors, but prototypes. What's the difference? Talk to each other for a minute. What's the difference, for example, between give and these other verbs that are synonyms, or put and these other synonyms? Talk to each other for a minute. What's the difference between the verbs in the left column and their synonyms in the right column? What differences do you notice? So the ones on the right are more specific in meaning and more specific to certain contexts. I would say I gave my son a ball. I wouldn't use donate or contribute or transfer. That would sound odd. It's like the ones on the left have more general meanings. What else do you notice? Right, because the ones on the left have much more general meaning. For example, if you're writing a paper, instead of give, you may want to go to a thesaurus and find a more specific word, because there are lots of words that are synonyms of give, but it's not the reverse, and so on for the others. What else? So again, they're more specifically defined in terms of how you use them, maybe the kinds of subjects that they go with, what's the subject of the verb in the sentence, or what kind of subject is possible, what kind of objects are possible, what kind of context you use them. Something else, I can say I gave my son a ball, or I gave a ball to my son. I have two different ways of saying it. I gave my son a ball, which is a dative patient structure, and I gave a ball to my son, which is a patient prepositional structure. Can you do that with contribute or donate or transfer? Do you have this, what we call a dative alternation with the other verbs of giving? I donated money to the charity. I donated the charity money. Can you do either one? Second one sounds a little odd. I contributed money to the charity. I contributed the charity money. Sounds odd. And again, that's because those have more specific meanings. And so there's certain meaning associated with different argument structures. Ita in Korean is a very general meaning to be, have, exist. There isn't an exact equivalent in English, by the way, and so it's kind of, and this is one reason I noticed that Korean writers will often overuse there is and there are in writing English papers. You're thinking of ita, and it translates kind of to a number of different English expressions, but they often default to there is, there are. And I think maybe nada is another verb like this. It's commonly used, like nemse nada. And the ones on the left are what we call light verbs, and they're kind of prototypical members of a particular category. Verbs of giving, verbs of putting, verbs of having, and verbs of going and such. They're light verbs, and they're prototypical members of the category. What verbs did you learn first as children? Did you first learn donate, contribute, transfer? No. You learned the light verbs first. These are the first verbs that you learn. So you first learn kind of a prototypical member of this kind of meaning category, and then learn others. So these are called light verbs, and this is an insight from a particular approach to cognitive semantics. Light verbs, certain properties, age of acquisition. That means when you learn the verb. So these are generally the first verbs that you learn as a child in your language. They have more general meanings. They're very frequent. So in spoken English, for example, these verbs are very frequent. They're much more frequent than donate or contribute. They're also used a lot in idioms, or if the grammar allows it, compounds. So in Korean, you have a lot of compound verbs with ita, or compounded phrases with ita and nada, toro nada. Or in English, a lot of idioms. Give me a break, give someone a break. Give me a chance, give me some flack. Put somebody in their place. Have a cow, which means to go get hysterical. Take it to the limit. That's an old song. Get over it. Go crazy. These are used a lot in idioms, and idioms will often use light verbs instead of specific verbs. So it's an interesting category of verbs. And in a few cases, like give, they have more than one argument structure that's possible, less so with the ones that are more specific. Donate and contribute are more specific because each one has only one possible argument structure, like a patient prepositional. Give money to the charity, give something to the foundation. Whereas give is a bit more flexible in the kind of arguments or semantic roles that it has. So let's look at what we call dative verbs. Verbs of giving are dative verbs. Dative because one of the arguments is a dative, an indirect object, one to whom something is given. They're also called ditransitive verbs. So ditransitive, so transitive is 타동사, it takes an object, and ditransitive means it takes two objects. So she gave him the ball. She gave the ball to him. They sent us a new computer, they sent a new computer to us. What do you think is the difference between the regular dative and then what we call the prepositional dative, which doesn't use a dative argument structure, but it uses a preposition to express the dative meaning instead of a true dative. So we call that a prepositional dative here with two, and the first one is a regular or true dative. What do you think the difference is? Okay, it's gotten a little quieter. What hypotheses do you have about the differences between these two? Emphasis. Okay, so that's partly the case, kind of what we call focus, what we're focusing on in terms of like the new information or the point of the sentence, or sometimes special emphasis. So she gave him the ball. That would more likely be in a context where I've been talking about him. Maybe it's my son. I've been talking about him, and I say him. And the ball is kind of new information, or it's the point of the sentence. It's if I say him, it's obvious because I was talking about my son. She gave the ball to him, might put more emphasis on him, to him, not to, that girl over there, but to him. It might emphasize to him. They sent us a new computer because us, obviously, we are talking. Or the number two, they sent a new computer to us, not to my boss, but to us. And that's one factor, what you're putting the focus on in the sentence. And that's one factor. And there's another factor at work. Can anyone guess this? This is a little harder. It's a semantic nuance. There is a slight nuance, a slight difference in meaning between these two options. The true dative, the regular dative, is just a regular dative where I'm emphasizing giving in the fact that the dative argument like him benefits or gets something. But in the prepositional dative, there's a slight difference. The emphasis is more on transfer, transferring possession. I have the ball and I transfer it to my son. They transfer a computer to us. So it's a bit of a transfer meaning, which is a little different. It's just a slight nuance. In practical context, it may not make much of a difference, but it's a slight nuance. This is more of a transfer meaning. The first one is more of just a regular garden variety dative meaning. And this is relevant because this also affects other expressions. We can put the regular dative kind of argument structure on other verbs that are not necessarily verbs of giving, but we give them that kind of meaning. She tossed him the ball. She hit him the ball. Maybe she threw him the ball, passed him the ball, bounced him the ball. Now these are verbs of motion, but we can give it also a dative or giving meaning by putting these verbs of motion or hitting into the dative framework. Dative patient, she passed him the ball. Or transfer, she tossed the ball to him, focusing on transfer. She passed the ball to him. She spiked. She could say to be, she spiked. That's when you hit a ball hard. She spiked or pummeled, hitting hard like that, or glided softly the ball to him, transfer. But does it work with the dative? She spiked him the ball. Does it work? No, because this, like if you're playing volleyball aggressively, this is not, you're not giving the person the ball. You're trying to, you're trying not to actually. It's more like a verb, you're emphasizing the manner of motion. Kind of a manner of motion verb. How did you hit it? I spiked it, I pummeled it, I glided it, whatever. And it doesn't work with the dative, with the giving kind of meaning. It might work with sort of a transfer. I spiked it into his face, playing volleyball aggressively. She gave them some money, but she contributed to them some money. Doesn't work because it's transfer of possession. I have money in my account and I transfer it to them. We can give verbs like toss new meanings or express different meanings. I can express transfer with the motion, or I can express just giving. She passed him the ball. This means that some verbs have maybe just one argument structure, and some verbs maybe allow for two different possibilities in their arguments. And it also means that the grammatical structure itself, the dative structure or the prepositional dative or the two, those structures themselves have meaning. Because I take the dative meaning, like from she gave them some money, and I apply this to she tossed him the ball, and that's different from the usual transfer meaning, she tossed the ball to him. So there's a certain meaning in the grammatical construction itself, according to this theory of language. There's a certain meaning in the grammatical structure itself. You can map out some of the common ones, a theme like the Santa Claus exists, you're talking about existence or states, agent, patient. That's your basic cause and effect. And a lot of, maybe when you learned your first verbs as a child, it was maybe some verb of cause and effect. You know, hit the cat or something, cause and effect. You know, baby hit cat, baby hit kitty or something like that. Cause and effect. Kids do that. They don't know how to treat animals nicely. Cause and effect. And they say datives, transfers, she baked him a cake, benefactive, which is kind of, she baked him a cake. It sounds like a dative, but if you reword it, it's she baked a cake for him, not to him. So she baked him a cake. It's sort of like, it's a benefactive, but you're also kind of merging it with the dative meaning. The meaning's a little more ambiguous. It's like it's almost like it's for him, benefactive, he's the one who benefits, but it also implies maybe he also was given the cake. But she baked a cake for him, you're emphasizing more the benefactive element. She baked it for him, she doesn't necessarily mean to give it to just him, because maybe he and his friends and their friends ate it together. State change, the car disappeared, patient number 7. Experiencer predicates, like I'm scared, or stimulus experiencer verbs, like the monster scared the boy, which is modeled on the agent patient or the cause effect kind of verb. So these kinds of argument structures, these sets of semantic roles with verbs, they themselves convey a certain meaning. You're saying this is a cause and effect kind of verb. Hit is a cause and effect. Shot, pounded, pummeled, spiked, cause and effect. Spiked the ball, cause the ball to move in a certain way. The argument structure itself, the grammatical construction itself, conveys a certain sort of meaning in addition to the words. And this can extend further to when you look at sentence and clause types. So going beyond the simple sentence, okay, simple sentence, the spider caught a fly in its web, and there's a cause and effect, caught a fly, cause and effect. But then you can have two main clauses, what we call a compound sentence, two main clauses, and that's a sentence is joined with a conjunction such as and, so, or, but. The spider caught a fly in its web and ate it for dinner. Or complex sentences. A complex sentence has a subordinate clause or dependent clause, a 정속절. Because it was hungry, the spider caught a fly, although it was hungry, whatever. So there's a difference in meaning between, for example, a complex sentence where one of the elements is a subordinate clause versus the others. Because main clauses kind of highlight, they draw your attention to the whole sentence. You give equal attention to every main clause. So in a compound sentence like number 2, you kind of give equal attention to both clauses when you read it. For 3, at least one reading experiment that I read shows that you read this a little more quickly. This is a subordinating conjunction, a dependent clause or a subordinate clause. You actually read this a little more quickly because the information is kind of secondary. So you make this information secondary, it's maybe providing explanation or contrast or comparison or an example. And the main clause is the main point. So you actually read the main clause more carefully. And if you look at people's eye movements when they read the main clause a little more carefully, they process it more carefully, and the subordinate clause is kind of secondary information. It's supporting information. And it's kind of backgrounded. It don't give it as much attention. And so there's a certain meaning to these kinds of clause types. And this is work from psycholinguistics and pragmatics. So you were probably taught grammar class how to construct subordinate clauses with like although and since and because and if and after and before. They probably didn't tell you why we use them. And that's to structure information, to highlight main information, the main point of the sentence in the main clause, and to make the other information more secondary. Maybe it's explanation or an example or a contrast. Participles, participle phrases, or participle is a verbal adjective. It also sort of backgrounds information. I could say it descended from the ceiling and grabbed the fly. I give equal weight to both, but I can give less attention to the first part, which makes for better flow, better narrative flow or storytelling flow. With a participle phrase, descending is a verb which also functions as an adjective. It's a verbal adjective. So descending from the ceiling, the spider grabbed the fly. So by kind of backgrounding this with a participle phrase, it flows better, which is different from a gerund or a verbal noun. The spider loves eating flies. I think I must have been hungry when I wrote these slides. Spider loves eating flies. It's a verb that also functions as a noun. It's an object of loves eating, and as a verb, eating can take an object like flies. The spider loves eating flies. It's a gerund. So it kind of foregrounds or emphasizes a noun. So participles are different. They can background information in context. In syntax, we have then what we call non-canonical sentences. So a canonical sentence is your standard subject-verb-object sentence. That's a canonical sentence. And it kind of gives equal weight to everything, especially what's in the predicate. Then we have special structures. I could say I want the dark chocolate, or I could say it's the dark chocolate I want. Or what I want is the dark chocolate, WH cleft. What's the difference? When do you say that? When do you say it's the dark chocolate that I want, or what I want is the dark chocolate? Between those and the normal sentences like I want the dark chocolate. Yeah, so you're putting emphasis, special emphasis or contrast. Like it's not the white chocolate, don't give me that sissy white chocolate stuff, I want the dark chocolate. You're emphasizing that. Okay, these are structures for emphasis. So these are special sentence types that have a special meaning of emphasis or contrast. Inversion. So saunter is kind of to walk kind of like this. So I could say a tired old man sauntered into the room, or I could say inverted sentences are more interesting. But what I've done here is I've put either an adjective phrase, like more interesting, that's an adjective phrase, interesting modified by more, or a prepositional phrase into the room. And the subject moves over to post-verbal position. The subject is now after the verb. More interesting or inverted sentences. I was actually writing a paper one time. I was writing about different types of sentences, and I wrote this. More interesting, however, are inverted sentences, and I realized, oh, that's an inverted sentence. It's an inverted sentence about inverted sentences. How ironic. Why do we use these? You put something else in front, and the subject moves to after the verb. Why? If you take my writing class, I'll show you examples in context. And context is easy to see. It's for better flow in narrative context. In a narrative context, it makes for better flow or transition. You're transitioning to something related. You might be talking about a room full of people, different kinds of people, and into the room sauntered a tired old man. Or B, I was actually writing about different types of sentence structures in a linguistics paper, and I wrote, more interesting, however, are inverted sentences. I made a transition to something related. The sentence structure, the grammatical structure itself, conveys a certain meaning in addition to the meaning of the words. So it's not just compositionality where the whole is the sum of the parts of the word meanings, but the structure itself conveys certain meaning. When you talk about different word classes or lexical classes, nouns or noun phrases themselves, you're talking about entities, you're talking about things, maybe concrete things like birds and tables, or more abstract things like love. You're talking about things, what we call entities, things in the discourse that you're talking about. Verbs tend to represent things like states, like exist, or actions and events, like swimming and eating. Adjectives and adverbs are modifiers or descriptors. We have gerunds, which kind of function as nouns and verbs. They are kind of events that also are things you talk about. I like eating chocolate. And participles are like adjectives, verbs functioning as adjectives, so that might have kind of an event meaning, but also a descriptor or modifier function. To summarize, meaning comes not only from the face value meaning of words. And so traditional semantics focused on face value meaning of words, or literal meaning of words. But in real human language, it doesn't quite work, because there's also metaphor and extension and grammaticalization. There's what we call the constructional meaning, where the argument structure or the sentence structure also conveys a certain meaning in the context. And there's also inferencing, which we'll maybe talk about when we talk about pragmatics later. And then all this depends on schemas, as we talked about. So that's kind of semantics and how semantics shapes syntax to some degree. Now for syntax. I hated syntax when I was a grad student, and it probably didn't help that my teachers were terrible. It's kind of theoretical. But since then, I've come to appreciate it a bit more. It gets kind of theoretical. You don't need to know all of this theoretical stuff, but let me just give you an overview. When Chomsky and his fellow generativists came along, they provoked a whole revolution in linguistics, and to some degree it was controversial, and not everyone agrees with all this. There's some people who don't agree with this framework, and that's fine. But sometimes when people criticize this, maybe they're more in people who do like a different theory of language, a different theory of grammar, or just different stuff like pragmatics or sociolinguistics. Sometimes when they criticize Chomsky and linguistics, they may actually have intelligent criticisms, but more often I see people like that who criticize these approaches who don't really understand the different theories fully, and it's like they don't know what they're criticizing. And so you have to be careful here. There are several different theories, and they kind of overlap, but we also need to distinguish them. There is the theory of universal grammar, and that's the idea that there are universal parameters, and we'll explain parameters a bit more, maybe next time. There are these universal parameters, or like how rules can be in a language, different universal parameters and rules that exist in all human languages. And a particular language will select certain options. So it's like a menu, a buffet, and a different language each language will choose its options from this menu, from this buffet of options, of kind of abstract options. So when children learn their first language, they have maybe built in their minds somehow, we're not sure how, according to the theory, an idea what are the possible parameters or possible rules that exist in human language. And then a child grows up being exposed to English from English-speaking parents, and the child identifies, okay, it's these parameters. The child hears these kinds of patterns in English, and the child activates these patterns in her mental knowledge of the universal grammar. Again, not everyone believes this, and this is somewhat controversial. There is some evidence for it, but it's debated. I tend to believe it, but it's open to debate, and I'm open-minded about it. So children kind of learn to identify the principles that exist in their language, and so that's part of how they learn their language. They have this deep down abstract mental knowledge of what's possible in the grammar of a language, and they hear, okay, I'm hearing this language and they do this, so the child learns that. The related theory, we talked about generative grammar, and it kind of overlaps with universal grammar. It's kind of a related theory. The grammar of all languages and language in general is defined by certain abstract rules and parameters. These are universal rules and parameters. They exist in all languages, and the rules generate, that is, they explain or account for all the possible sentences that a person could say in the language. It will explain what's possible to say in the language and what's not possible to say in the language. And these rules form the native speaker's competence. So native speaker is always right, even if they speak dialect or low speech or whatever. They are speaking according to a certain grammar. This is an abstract mental knowledge they have. If you ask the native speaker why do you say it like that, they may not be able to tell you, but subconsciously they know they have a grammar in their heads. It's their competence, their innate knowledge of what's possible in my language. That's the native speaker competence. They know, they cannot probably explain it, but they know they have this mental knowledge of what is possible. And you can ask them, could you say this in English? And they'll say yes or no, at least in their dialect. Then there's syntactic theory, Chomskyan syntactic theory, and this gets more controversial. So the surface form of the sentence is not all there is. There also exists an underlying abstract structure. So for example, Johnny's easy to please. John is technically the patient of please, but John, we say, moves over to the subject position of the main verb. And so we say John is easy to please. And we don't say is easy to please John. We move John over to the first part because is needs a subject more than please does. So that's kind of what we call a transformation. A sentence grammar consists of constituents and hierarchies. I'll show you what that means in a minute. And these constituents they're defined in a certain way. Don't worry about those details. I'll kind of show you, and if I have time today, I'll show you a little bit. You don't need to understand all of that because I don't expect you to understand Chomsky's syntactic theory. It's pretty abstract and technical and theoretical. I just want to show you the basics of how it works, whether you follow the Chomskyan variety or some other alternative theory. So the possible kind of phrase elements are defined in a certain way. They have certain properties. I'll show you a little bit later. And things like the John is easy to please. When John moves over to subject position, that's called a transformation or derivation or movement. And this is how you explain the difference between the abstract structure, like John is a patient of object of please, but he's actually in the subject of is. So he moves. John moves over there. Movement. And this is also kind of controversial. Not everyone believes in this. People who do research in Chomsky syntax, they believe in it very strongly. If you want to have an argument with them, just ask them to provide empirical evidence. You don't need to know this, but in the early days when Chomsky proposed this idea of transformations, movement, kind of got out of hand because people started proposing all kinds of transformations and all kinds of sentences. And you ended up with proposals that say this sentence would have maybe 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 transformations involved from the abstract to the surface sentence that somebody actually speaks. And this kind of got really crazy in the 60s and 70s. I think in the 70s, some psychologists tested this because this implied if this sentence involves 1 transformation and this sentence has 5 transformations, we should be able to test this in the lab and how long it takes people in the lab to process the sentences. Psychologists found no difference between the two, between transformationally simple sentences and more complex sentences. So Chomsky kind of went back and started revising his theories over the years. They went through some branding changes and name changes. He and his other fellow syntacticians incorporated other contributions from other people. They reduced the number of transformations a lot, streamlined it. And one way they did this was by adding a lot of other abstract categories to the tree structure or the phrase structure. We don't need to know that. But today it's called minimalism or a minimalist syntax or the minimalist program. I'm not going to teach you minimalism. It's way too hard and it just gives me a headache. And I'm not expecting you to know that. I'm not going to teach it. I'm just going to show you kind of what phrase structure is, the basic ideas of phrase structure and constituents and the hierarchy. Just the basic ideas, and that's all you need to understand. You don't need to understand the specifics of this theory. There are people who don't agree with any of this. Maybe some people look at this as, I don't want to do this. I'll just do pragmatics and I'll be happy. Or I'll do sociolinguistics and I'll be happy. And there's some people who look at this and like, I like the first part. I like the generative ideas, the basic generative ideas, but I don't like all this movement stuff. I don't believe in that. And there are alternate theories. People who have alternate theories. And I won't get into that because it's confusing. But there are alternate theories. But this is this is kind of an oversimplified picture of the phrase structure or constituents, the phrasal elements in a sentence. For example, the top node, we call it the sentence node. It defines this is the sentence. This is the phrase structure for a whole sentence. And it consists of a noun phrase for the subject. So this is a noun phrase, and like the cat. This is a specifier. We call this a specifier. It's a function word that modifies a content word. Call that a specifier. In this case, it's an article. It could also be other things like each or all or this or that. This cat, each cat, all cats. My cat. Then we have a verb phrase, which consists of verb and then the stuff that follows the verb, the predicate. And it could be the verb with an object. The cat chased the mouse. It could be a preposition, like the cat sat on the mat. Here we have a prepositional phrase, which consists of the preposition and then a noun phrase, the mat. And that consists of a specifier and a noun. And that's kind of what the phrase structure looks like. That's kind of a simplified presentation of phrase structure. You may be wondering, why the heck do I need to know this? I'll show you maybe in a little bit what this buys us in terms of being able to describe the grammar of languages and what's possible in different languages. And that's why they do this. You may be wondering why all this structure. Does this mean we think in terms of tree diagrams in our head when we're doing sentences? No. Does this mean you really do movements and transformations in your head before you actually speak a sentence? Well, it's kind of debatable what that idea of movement really means. If you corner a Chomskyan syntactician and say, okay, give me some psychological, scientific evidence for this movement that you claim exists in sentence grammar and syntax. And they say, well, it's just a representation for something. Well, what does it represent? I don't know. It's something that people debate and argue about. So if you take a syntax class where the professor is a strong believer in this, if you want to argue with the person, just say, ask for scientific evidence. Give me some empirical scientific evidence. That's a good way to start an argument. If you go to a bar with a syntactician, start a bar fight. Demand scientific proof of this stuff, okay? And the syntactician will say, well, it works. When we apply this to the grammar of different sentences in different languages, it works. But I want scientific evidence. And they'll argue about, and I don't want to get into these arguments. However, even if we don't agree with some of the aspects of this theory, it is a nice way of explaining how different sentence structures work and how different kinds of sentences are related to each other, how a standard sentence is related to a cleft sentence or a question sentence where you move the verb in front, like, do you have any chocolate? It does explain how different kinds of sentences are related to each other, even if you don't agree with some of the mechanical aspects of this theory. Let's see, constituents. We're going to talk about constituents maybe next time, because things like, we see the noun phrase and the verb phrase, prepositional phrase, those are constituents. So for example, a noun phrase like the cat, that's a constituent and it's part of a bigger constituent. The cat sat on the mat. Well, the mat is a noun phrase. It's also part of a bigger constituent, the verb phrase or predicate, sat on the mat. And that's part of a bigger constituent, the sentence phrase, the sentence node. How many of you look at this and go, what the heck is this? When you look at the phrase structure, how many of you are going, what the heck is this? Why do we need to do this? We'll get into this more next time. The basics of how phrase structure works, and again, what it can explain, and how it can describe different grammars. I'll try to explain it in a user-friendly way, because the book doesn't. And this is really hard. This is hard stuff. It's theoretical. And again, I'm just going to explain what I think you need to understand, what you need to know for this class, not all the stuff that's in the book. Anyway, good luck on your assignments. Enjoy your homework. I'll see you later.